Dolakbo is a partner, detailed solicitors and leads. So today Dolakbo will be taking us on this final class. She's going to present her papers in 2 segments. So the first session will take about 45 minutes, and the second session will take another 45 minutes. But in between, Ms. Nta Epiken will coordinate the question and answer sessions. So we look forward to an interesting session. Dolakbo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tobina, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great opportunity to be here. I'm happy to be here, and I hope, as Tobina said, a lot of you have learned a lot from the past. I think we've had 10 weeks so far, which has really been very interesting, and I hope that a lot of you have learned from this. I would say a very big thank you to the Nigerian Bar Association for doing this and for giving me this opportunity to be able to talk about, let me just put up my screen so that you can know what I'm talking about today. So it's, as Tobina said, it's going to be in 2 segments. I will first start with talking about Nigerian power sector's market structure. In talking about its market structure, I will also be talking about developments in the power sector since 2005 till date, and talking a little bit about some of the things that have happened post-privatization. So, in terms of an outline, you can see my screen, just 1 minute. So, just 1 minute, let me slide share. Okay, better. So in terms of an outline, in looking at the market structure for the Nigerian power sector, we'll look at the key players in the Nigerian power sector. We'll look at the Nigerian power market, its design, how it was designed, and how it has played out. In looking at how it has played out, we'll be talking about some of the events that have happened, some of the things that you probably seen in papers. For some of you who are watching or listening, you've probably been part of in terms of advising clients in one way or the other, or maybe you just read in newspapers, or you just attended webinars where people are talking about, a lot of the things that have happened in the power sector, or you are just a power consumer who is just wondering, who doesn't do power, or doesn't do energy, or doesn't work in power, and just wondering, okay, what is all this about? I'm hoping that at the end of this session, you'll be able to understand a bit more about where Nigeria's power sector is coming from, and maybe it will give a bit of understanding, as it has been for me, even going through preparing for this, how much would I say progress, or how much has gone on or has gone into Nigeria's power sector. We'll then talk about some of the challenges and post-privatization developments. So I'm hoping to be able to, from this first session, to be able to help you see the Nigerian power sector in a concise form, for you to be able to understand, okay, what has gone on, what were the drafters of the law, the electric power sector reform, are thinking about. How did they design it? Okay, then what went wrong? What didn't go so wrong? What are we still battling with? Why are we where we are? So, jumping into it quickly. Now, just to say before I go on, that the second session will then be about renewables, and will be about mini grids. So basically renewables, decentralized power. We'll talk about mini grids, and we'll talk about renewable space generally in Nigeria. If there are charts, if there are charts or things that I need to know, or if there's something wrong with my audio or something, please feel free to just let me know, because I will not be looking at charts as I'm going on with it. So if there's anything that I need to know, please draw my attention to it.
I will, Dolakbo. So you're fine for now.
Thank you. So this is a snapshot of the key players in the Nigerian power sector. We try to put almost everybody there. And I will try to explain. Now, the greens on the top are more the policymakers and regulators. Those in blue in the middle, in the next row, are what we call enablers. And we will, as we go into the slide, you understand more. Now, those in dark blue, and you have arrows pointing to different places, which I will explain a little bit more of as we go into the slides, are more the participants. The greens and the oranges at the bottom are also participants. So everybody from the dark blues down to the greens and the oranges you can see at the bottom are participants. So on the policy side, you have the Ministry of Power, you have the Energy Commission of Nigeria, who basically feeds in policy to the Ministry of Power, which is still overseen by the Ministry of Power. Then you have NERC, the Nigeria Electricity Regulation Commission, who is our main regulator, as established by the Electric Power Sector Reform Act. And then you have Ministry of Water Resources. Some of you may wonder why Ministry of Water Resources here, but we know that we are also a hydroelectricity producing country. And our Ministry of Water Resources also requires that permits are gotten and licenses are gotten for commercial use of water. For power generation, apart from when you are talking about hydroelectricity, which is basically creating or generating power from dams, even when you are generating gas power generation, you usually require water in large quantities as well. Then we have the Ministry of Environment, who would be looking at more around the environmental impact of power projects. So there are certain regulatory requirements that are required. We'll go into it as we go into the slides. The second leg is the Rural Electrification Agency, which we'll touch on in the course of this, the Gas Aggregation Company of Nigeria, MBED, being the Transmission Company of Nigeria, NELMCO, BPE, NEMSA, NDPHC, and we'll talk about them in the middle of in the slides. These are entities that were set up, some by law, some by regulation, some by regulation and law, but are also like TCN and MBET are also companies set up under the Companies and Allied Matters Act. They were set up to basically do certain functions in the sector. And then you then have the dark blues, who are the participants. You have participants on the gas side. A lot of you would have, if you participated in this course, you would have done a lot around gas in terms of this energy course we've been doing. I know that there have been lectures around gas, the role of Nigerian gas company, independent oil companies, local independents. So basically, because we are a gas producing nation, gas is still a major part of our power generation. So gas producers are part of the people who we consider the players as well. And then you have who we call the successor generation companies. Basically, these are generation companies or plants. These are generation plants that are embedded in companies that were set up by government as part of the unbundling of the Nigerian power sector, and we'll talk about that. We also have the Nigerian integrated power projects, which were subsequently built to supplement what was already on the ground. I'm sure that you have read in the news and all of that, how they say, oh, government has spent so much on NIPPs and they still are not, they still haven't been privatized, they still haven't been bought and all of that. And then you have other players at the bottom, those in the off-grid space. Our next session will be more about the off-grid space and decentralized power, but we will be concentrating more on the on-grid space now. We have independent power producers as well, embedded power producers, as we said, legacy FGN plants, who form part of what we call successor generation companies. We also have eligible customers and franchises. So I will talk about them in the slide. So this slide was just to give you a bird's eye view of the key players in the sector. Okay. So I'm going to run through this, just pointing out the key things that you need to know about each of these people, these players. Now we're looking at those who are in the policy and regulatory space. So the Federal Ministry of Power, as you know, is the policy making arm, and is basically provisions of the Electric Power Sector Reform Act stating what ways it's supposed to formulate policies and how it gives how the ministry also gives guidance even to the regulator. the Energy Commission of Nigeria basically has the mandate to basically deal with overall energy sector planning. And just to say that energy sector planning actually is even much more than just electricity. So strategic planning around, even fossil fuels and as well as renewables. So it's more around energy, the field of energy in all its ramifications. That's the role of the ECN. So far, I know that the ECN has its own act, but practically it's still somewhat under the oversight of the Federal Ministry of Power. Now, the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission is the main player in the electric power sector space, and is the basically our independent regulator in the power space, and has a mandate to promote and ensure that we have efficient market structure and an investor-friendly environment in the power sector to basically ensure that consumers on one hand get what they need. Investors on the other hand are able to invest and get a decent return, but consumers are also well taken care of. So whilst they promote competition and private sector participation, they are also supposed to protect consumers, and they're also supposed to license and regulate anyone involved in generation, transmission, system operation, distribution, or trading of electricity. And they're also supposed to monitor. So they are a key component of our power sector. And for the Ministry of Environment, it's basically around, if we're looking at it from the power side, is basically around the impact of electricity generation on the environment. And by the Environment Impact Assessment Act, for projects like power projects, you are required to basically get an environmental impact assessment. It's important to note that NERC regulations actually state that if you have a project that's less than 10 megawatts, you do not necessarily need to have an environmental impact assessment. However, just to say that even though that's what has been said, most times with investors, and most times now, investors are very particular about what the impact, knowing what the impact and being able to have something in writing as to what the impact, the environmental and social impact of a project will be. So even where the law doesn't provide for it, depending on who's providing the money in that project, most times you find that the sponsors will still have to have some kind of impact assessment. So we've talked about the Federal Ministry of Water Resources, and I explained how it relates to power projects. First, we have hydropower, and one of the things that the Act says, the Water Resources Act 1993, there's also a Water Resources Bill. I don't think it has become an act, and that's the most stringent one. But the Water Resources Act basically talks about licensing for commercial use of water. And if you were using water for a hydro project, for generating electricity, you would need a license. If you were also using what is considered commercial quantities for a thermal project for cooling, it would also require a license. So we'll talk about the Rural Electrification Agency a bit more, but the Rural Electrification Agency is basically also established by the Electric Power Sector Reform Act. Everywhere where you see EPSRA, it is the Electric Power Sector Reform Act. And what it was created to do is that it basically helps facilitate, affording power supply in more, it says rural. So the argument is that it is rural, but you find that yes, their remit, a lot of it is in rural, underserved areas, but they've also been doing projects in urban areas around markets and around universities. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we go into the next session. But just to say that the Rural Electrification Agency is also one of the key proponents or one of the key enablers of what we've been doing in the renewable energy space so far in terms of projects and mini grids as well in Nigeria. We'll talk about that, as I said, in the next slide. The Gas Aggregation Company of Nigeria, GACN, basically a company that was set up by gas producers to aggregate gas, basically, so to deal with, remember that we're a gas producing country. However, because we haven't made, let me not let me say that because we don't have enough gas to go around, given the constraints to producing gas on a commercial level. And what I mean is that given the constraints with the fact that a lot of the gas producers don't see a market that can buy their gas for the cost. Let me put that simply. Because they don't see a market that can buy gas at the cost, gas appears scarce, even though we have loads of it in the ground. And what was done earlier, as we found that gas became more useful when we were building plants and not realizing they needed gas, and we then needed gas to power the plants. What was the idea that GACN will be set up to basically manage that demand for gas, particularly for the government-owned plants. And the main reason for that was because they couldn't pay cost-reflective tariffs. The price of the gas that they were buying at the time is not one that could possibly pay on a commercial basis. So there had to be a framework, set up by government and then GACN being established to manage demand, manage what is called an aggregate price, and how the payment goes to different buyers and suppliers. So most of the gas producers that form part of GACN are the IOCs who were mandated under their domestic supply obligations to do this. It's also supposed to have a network administrator role. I'm not quite sure that it has that role right now. And a future role of being a commercial gas trading platform. That is still a future role. I don't know that it has happened yet. But for A and B that you see here, yes, in a sense, GACN has that role. MBET, the Nigeria Bulk Electricity Trading Company, again, just to explain the reason why we have MBET in the system, is that we started a power sector in which government was basically the one building the plants and providing the power. And there's been underinvestment for many years under NEPA. Now, to be able to get commercially viable entities or commercially viable electricity business, and we'll talk about the unbundling and all that had to be done under the Act, one of the things that was envisaged by the Act is that we would have a bulk electricity trader. And the bulk electricity trader, if I put it in very simple terms, is not exactly the same, but it plays the same role in a way that GACN plays, but on the power side. So MBET does not own any power plant. MBET does not own any wires. MBET just sits as a contractual counterparty in between the generation companies and the distribution companies. So basically, it signs contracts with generation companies to say, I will take your power, I will take committed quantities of power from you, and it then says to the discos, I will sell to you committed quantities. Under a power purchase agreement, it takes power from generation companies, and under a vesting contract, power is supplied or power is committed to the distribution companies. It doesn't take part in how the power gets there. It's basically just a contractual counterparty who takes power from one and ensures that one person gets paid and ensures that it collects money from another part. We'll talk about the reason why it's not exactly working, but the idea was to have a credible party in the middle, because we didn't have a market that parties could just contract with themselves yet. That would be further down the line. And as we talk about Nigeria's market structure, we'll talk about that. What we then had to do was have a contractual counterparty that was supposed to be financially credible and be able to buy power from generation companies and pay the generation companies for their power and collect the money from the distribution companies. Where everything fell down, we are still carrying it up, is because the distribution companies are not able to pay the amount of money to pay the generation companies. But suffice to say that that's why MBET is set up. So going to the next slide. So remember how I said that MBET is set up basically to be that contractual party, and that MBET doesn't own any wires. So the Transmission Company of Nigeria then owns the wires and is basically licensed by, sorry, I forgot to mention that MBET is also licensed by NERC. and regulated and should be regulated. It is regulated by NERC as well. So Transmission Company of Nigeria, 100% government owned, is licensed to basically ensure that when a generation company sells power, that is supposed to go to a distribution company. That is supposed to go to a distribution company, basically. They are supposed to will that power to whoever it is that requires it. So you have 3 business units under the Transmission Company of Nigeria. You have a transmission service provider who is responsible for open access transmission, basically to develop the infrastructure itself, maintain that infrastructure, develop it, extend it, and all that. The system operator is like the traffic controller, ensuring that there is technical stability, ensuring that there is grid frequency, ensuring that we don't have what they call system collapses. So if you hear that there's a system collapse, the person who is in the middle of all that is usually the system operator. And then we have the market operator who is responsible for administering the market and basically administering the commercial aspects of the market, who basically is able to say, okay, this person sold 2,000 megawatts today. That person sold 500 megawatts yesterday. And basically every month is able to send out a sheet to embed to say, these are the people who supplied power, and this is the amount of power that they supplied, and this is what they should be paid. Basically, it states what everybody in the system should be paid, and the market rules are the rules that guide it. Now, for NAMCO is not one of those active operators in the sector, but was created as part of the market structure, as part of basically the whole thing around the privatization of the sector and the unbundling. So NAMCO was incorporated basically to take away all the liabilities. When the successor companies were set up, I will talk a little bit about that process of unbundling. They needed to, the intention was to sell companies without debt. So the stranded debts of all the different companies or the different entities under the grand NEPA were housed in NAMCO for NAMCO to basically be able to deal with. So NAMCO basically administers stranded liabilities, it manages pension liabilities and what they call non-core assets. Non-core assets in those days, and for some of you who were part of the privatization, NEPA had a lot of what we call non-core assets. They even had property abroad. They had a lot of property, in different parts of the country. So these were non-core assets that NAMCO was supposed to dispose of and sell to be able to pay the debts that had been taken out of the companies. So the BPE, can you go a little faster now? The BPE is established by the Public Enterprises Privatization and Commercialization Act and basically implements the federal government's privatization policies. As regards the power sector itself, BP currently holds 40% shares in privatized distribution companies on behalf of the federal government and the Ministry of Finance Incorporated, and has also issued 2 concession rights to 2 hydro plants. That's Kainji, Jeba. Well, Kainji and Jeba are together, and then Shiruru. So it's 2 plants, 2 essential plants, but Kainji and Jeba are together. And in a few of the thermal generation companies, it still holds 20%. A few, most of them are 100% owned, privatized. NEMSA came up in 2015 and was established to basically take over the functions of what was the Electrical Inspectorate Services Department under the Federal Ministry of Power. And what it does essentially is to enforce quality standards, ensure that power systems and network projects are properly executed, specify technical standards. Sorry, there's something incomplete here. Specify technical standards with respect to maintenance of electric power plants, transmission systems, and electricity lines. A lot of people say that NEMSA's role kind of conflicts with NERC's role. But I think that NEMSA has kind of found its place, and I think that they are coexisting in a way. But suffice to say that I think that NERC still remains the regulator. NDPHC, as I explained earlier, was a parallel. So this was another idea of government to increase generation. And basically NDPHC is owned by federal, state, and local governments. And they put this money together to build these plants. And we've been trying to privatize them for almost 7-8 years now, and we are trying to privatize. We've cancelled one privatization, as we recently heard, and we are trying to privatize them. We are starting another process. That's another story for another day. So moving on. Okay. So a lot of who I've talked about, we've talked about policy makers, we talked about regulators, we talked about enablers. Now it's around the players. And I'm sure that most of you know who these are, but just to explain, when I use the word GENCO, I use the word DISCO, I use the word IPPs, what I'm saying. So a GENCO is basically one of those companies that was owned by government and that had been privatized. One of the power generation companies that was unbundled and was owned by government and is now privatized. Examples like Green Power, Shiru Hydroelectric, Gili Transco, and the NIPP plants are also basically called GENCOs. And a DISCO is basically one of the distribution companies that were privatized as well. So what we had before was a whole block NEPA. And then we had PHCN, Power Holding Company of Nigeria, which was supposed to be the whole set up to hold the different parts of the business until they then became fully unbundled. So before they became fully unbundled, you had the distribution companies in zones. So you had distribution companies in the zones, and it's those zones that have now become what we call distribution companies, and they're now public limited liability companies. So a distribution company is basically one that has a distribution license that has been issued by NERC. It's one of those companies that has been unbundled or privatized that has a distribution license. GENCOs also have generation licenses as well. An independent power plant, now what's the difference between a GENCO and an independent power plant? They both generate power. The difference is basically this, that an independent power plant is one that was basically privately built or privately developed and privately financed. That's the best way I would put it. So you have plants in Nigeria such as Shellafam, and Shellafam was, as the name portends, was developed by Shell. You have Ajipopai. Ajipopai was developed by Opai. You have Azura Power, which is the first totally privately financed. It's not like Shellafam and Ajipopai were not privately financed. They're financed by IOCs. But Azura was one of the poster child for privately financed independent power projects. So that's essentially the difference. And just to say that in the sector, the GENCOs are often the whipping boys. And what I mean is that the terms on which they have PPAs with embeds is not typically, their PPAs are kind of different because of their, let me say, because of their, I don't want to say because of their ownership at the moment, because most of them are privatized, or because of where they are coming from, they are older plants. Some of these older plants, Shell, Afam, and Ajip, even though they were financed, or built or developed by IOCs, also did them under different terms. So they developed them under different terms and had different terms for securitizing payments. Azura Power also, as you would know, has different terms for securitizing payments. So its PPAs or its power purchase agreements and its contractual structure tends to be a bit different from what we have with the GENCOs. Who are eligible customers? Basically, very simply, they are customers that are able to purchase power directly from generation companies or IPPs. So any entity that falls under the basically the criteria that is given by the regulation, we have eligible customer regulations. Any customer that falls within those eligibility criteria is who is called an eligible customer. And the eligible customer regulations are an offshoot of provisions of the Electric Power Sector Reform Act that says that the Ministry of Power will declare eligible customers. Okay, so who are franchisees? I'm going to run through this, but franchisees, basically, this is one of the newest trends, and I think we'll talk about it. Let me leave this. I will talk about this in terms of talking about the post-privatization developments. But franchises are what you are going to be seeing in the future. We have existing regulations for them now, but it's one of the things that we're going to see in the future of the sector going forward. Embedded generation we've had a regulation since 2012, but we haven't had much of embedded generation. I will talk about that as we go on the slides. So we are talking about the Nigerian power market structure. Still, we've actually started talking about it. So what I'm going to be dealing with here is more around how the market was designed. Some of the things that happened from 2005 to date, and how the market was originally designed, but how it has evolved. So what you'll be hearing from here on, I'm going to kind of paint a picture of what was originally, what the power sector was originally designed to do, and what it has evolved and started doing, or what has had to happen, as we've gone on. What are the issues? So a few notable events from 2005 that we need to note. One was the issue of the EPSRA in 2005. I'm starting from up here, kind of like the center, and I'm going to go from my own right, all the way here. So first is issue of the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, so the enactment of the Electric Power Sector Reform Act in 2005, and the establishment of the Power Holding Company of Nigeria, which I mentioned, which was supposed to be the holding company to hold all the assets of the defunct NEPA. And then you have, as a result of this process, you then had the generation companies and strong companies, the companies themselves. The companies were first set up, and then the assets are owned by those companies. So it was part of the unbundling process. What you had was a mammoth NEPA first, which was broken down in the Power Holding Company of Nigeria, which was then set up to hold all those assets. Then you had those assets now being unbundled or divided, basically untangled or divided. And remember that we said that they were supposed to go without liabilities. So we then had companies, public limited liability companies, set up to be able to hold each of those assets. So generation companies, they set up generation companies that were going to hold the generation assets. Distribution companies, remember that I said that the distribution business was in zones. So that's why you find that discos kind of run across, some of them run across, apart from Lagos, that has 2 distribution companies. A lot of the other discos or distribution companies they run across states because they covered zones. So you have, at this point in November 2005, the Gencos and discos, or the companies themselves, were set up. And if you can actually go to CAC, and you'd actually see that these are actual companies that are set up as companies. Their initial shareholders were BP and MUFI. That's the Ministry of Finance Incorporated. By the EPSRA Act that was already set up at the time, the regulator was supposed to be established. So by 31st of October 2005, the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission was established. TCN, which was the Transmission Company of Nigeria, also a company, was incorporated in November 2005. And then the transfer of assets started in July 2006. Now, note that whilst this was going on, MBET was not incorporated until 2010. And then in August 2010, we had our roadmap for the power sector reform. So it was at this point that we had some kind of, the EPSRA gave a roadmap in a way of broadly what you know, the journey was going to look like, or what the roadmap was going to look like to privatization or to unbundling of our electricity sector. But the roadmap now gave more details as to the reform. So fast forward from August 2010, by November 2013, between August 2010 and November 2013, it was bids, it was the whole process of privatizing the sector, where we had different people give bids, due diligence, paying off of liabilities to NEPA staff, not allowing, the labor unions not allowing the bidders to go in to look at the assets. A lot happened, very interesting times between 2010 and 2013. But by November 2013, a number of the DISCOs and GENCOs have been privatized, not all of them. I think we still had
Dollar Boy, if you can hear me, I think you're frozen.
Yeah.
apologies.
Back.
Well, I hope you can hear me well.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Please, if it lags or for whatever reason it doesn't sound good, please call my attention so that I can change.
Yes, we will. Just go on.
Interesting thing.
Yeah. This is where you were.
Okay. Just want to stop subtitles. Okay. So we then had privatization majorly completed by that day for some of the transactions I was on. Very interesting. And I think it was Kaduna, as I was saying, Kaduna, I think AFAM came on with the privatization process ended, I think, another like a year or a few months later. We then had the interim rules. I'm going to go into some detail in the subsequent slides about some of these things. We went into interim rules, and then we had TEM on the 1st of February 2015. And then we had a very dark time when we were supposed to be on the road. So by the time TEM commenced, we had a path to cost-reflective tariffs. What do cost-reflective tariffs mean? Basically, that power that we pay for is reflective of the cost that goes into it. The typical example that is always given is that if you go and buy bread, basically you can't be buying bread, a loaf of bread, for less than the cost of what the baker sells, including the cost of transport, you know, that's or the logistics that the baker has to put into it. You should be selling bread and anything, you know, at a cost-reflective price. So we had a very dark time in March 2015 when we had what was kind of like the path to a cost-reflective tariff, and it was then removed. There was a removal of collection losses, which set us back for a number of years, and when we had a lot of debt overhang in the sector. Not like the debts have disappeared now, but there was a lot of debt, a lot of shortfall when we would have made progress. People say many things about what happened. It was elections, it was politics. However way you view it, it may have been all of the above, but it set us back. We talked about the establishment of NEMSA. Then we then had a new government, and one of the things that the minister did was to announce the eligible customer, to declare eligible customers. Now, was that the right thing to do? I think, okay, this was when we had the regulation, but I think eligible customers was, in, I think 2016, or I think it was 2016 that was declared before the regulations. So fast forward, a lot has happened in the sector, but where are we now? 28th of August 2020. we're not where we should be in terms of our cost-effective tariffs, but we have what is called the service-based tariff. And I'm sure most of you can tell me about the fact that you are paying more now, but you're not even getting the power that you need. Or you're not getting the power that you expected that you should be getting, whether you're on 12 hours, whether you're on 20 hours, whether you're on 10 or less than 10. Okay, moving on. So this slide is just to talk about what was envisaged. What was the design of the power sector? What did we envisage that the power sector was going to be like? Now, under the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, the Power Sector Reform Act envisaged two main stages: one pre-privatization and one post-privatization. And pre-privatization was basically all those things I've said, which is unbundling, restructuring the sector, making it ready for private investment to come in, putting the assets into limited liability companies so that you could have people invest in those companies. So establishing what will be the performance incentives for these private people who come in to be able to perform in distribution and generation. So in a nutshell, that's what was envisaged under the Act, in very, very concise manner, but it was much more than that. And as you go into the other slides, which I don't really have time to see, but breeze through very quickly. And the post-privatization stage was basically declaring the path to declaring a more competitive market, where, remember we talked about embeds, where embeds, rather than being the one in the middle, will then come out of being in the middle and parties will begin to contract with each other. Have we started to do that now? And this existing contract is to innovating basically to, I don't want to use the word transfer, but basically innovation, and I'm sure most of you know, there are lawyers here. So innovation is basically stepping into the shoes of another party. So what would happen, what was envisaged to happen was that the discos would step into the shoes of embed with respect to certain contracts that they had with Gencos. And then Gencos could sell to discos, Gencos could sell to eligible customers, you know, and ancillary services, basically services that are provided by generation companies to stabilize the grid, could be sold, you know, to an independent system operator that we are supposed to have, which we do not yet quite have, but I know that there is a consultation paper out around that. And then independent power producers as well, I've explained who independent power producers are, will be able to sell their power, you know, to discos, basically everybody will be able to trade with everybody in a nutshell, you know. And then there'll be an establishment of an independent system operator who would no longer be TCN in having different units, but will be an independent system operator that will take care of, that could even have private investment and shareholders. The structure of that is still being debated at the moment or consulted upon at the moment. But it could, in other countries, you find that you have the operators being part of the ISO. In other countries, you find that you have some private investments. And I think in some other countries as well, you actually have them listed on the stock exchange. So this was what was envisaged. Now, what happened? I think we've talked a lot about this. So I'm going to skip this slide very quickly. What has happened so far? That's what was envisaged. Just to say that the EPSRA Act, I still think, you know, although, you know, I guess that things have evolved, so they need to amend parts of it just to make it more reflective of reality. But I think that to a large extent, you know, is a good piece of legislation that was meant to effect our privatization. Now, whether we've obviously gone past a number of things and a number of things have changed. But the point I'm just trying to make is that with respect to what the Act envisaged, what NERC then did was then to break it down even more in what we now have as the market rules. So what I have on this subsequent slide is just more of, I'm not really going to talk through this because I think we talked about them because I'm going to go to the parts we've not really talked about. So this is just talking about the different, so for the prioritization process, this is just talking about the more of the details of what happened. establishing of an initial holding company, which is PHCN, licensing that initial company, just to say, okay, where are we? And all of this was done. Formation of succession companies, all this was done. Transfer of assets to successor companies, all this, was done. We talked about this interim license to successor companies, all this were done. So this is history. Establishment of an independent regulator, all this was done. Commencement of privatization process, this was done, as we discussed. Now, this is where I want to start from. We privatized in 2013. So ordinarily, what was anticipated that at time when you privatize and you have private sector coming in, they begin to run the business as private sector. However, there were a few constraints. We still didn't have effective contracts. There was no way that we could begin to have effective contracts because customers were not paying tariffs that were cost reflective. And there were a few issues with having, what do I say about effective contract? That means that everything in the contract, I can enforce a guarantee against you. None of the entities were in any form, shape, or manner in a place to go into properly commercial contracts. So and the main thing was that the basis for the tariff, the cost reflective tariff, was supposed to be revalidating what was called aggregate technical and commercial and collection losses. Remember that for many years, the DISCOs and the GENCOs were run as government entities, and they were loss-making. Now, what the private entities were called to do was to reduce aggregate technical and commercial. That was their key KPI, particularly for the DISCOs. Now, for them to be able to do, one of the main things they needed to be able to do that was a cost reflective tariff. But they needed to validate what is the starting point of that commercial and collection loss. What is it? I came into this business, you're telling me that the loss is, let's say, 60%. I need to revalidate it because when I revalidate, I'll be able to tell you what my tariff would be. So I'm just trying to put that in very simple terms. That's what the interim stage was for. The interim stage was supposed to give the new owners a chance to go through that revalidation process so that they could arrive at a cost reflective tariff and hopefully start on a commercial basis. We are still here. We are not in the interim stage. But we are still on our journey to cost reflective tariff. But that was the basis for the interim rules. So the interim rules was set up to kind of run the market, not in a commercial way, but run the market whilst the things that needed to be done were done. Now, we then moved subsequently to the transition electricity market stage and different things that were supposed to be in place for us to have a transitional electricity market. What is even a transitional electricity market? Basically, it was supposed to be characterized by a number of things. One was cost reflective, it was enforceable contracts, which we didn't have fully enforceable at the time when this was announced. But let me say that there was not much of a choice. We had to move forward in some way with what we had to do. At this time, government had also put in the 213 billion naira facility to kind of kickstart the market. The only problem is that what we've had in the power sector is that we are constantly chasing our tail. So at every point in time when government comes out with an intervention, by the time the intervention is done, we find that we still have another problem, and that's why it seems like the government is spending a lot of money. But going into the slide, this just lists what was envisaged by the market rules, what NERC envisaged needed to be done for us to enter into a proper market, a transitional electricity market that was characterized by contract-based arrangements. So these are some of the conditions. I can't go through each of them now because we are going out, and I want to take questions before we go into the next slide, but I will just point out the ones that I think are worth pointing out. Okay, so there was supposed to be a commencement date for all formal trading arrangements. NERC NERC said that this was sufficiently done. I guess that it wasn't done for everybody, to be honest, but at some point I think this made it efficiently done because at the time, you know, maybe at least 75%, you know, had this done. Attainment of sufficient degree of privatization of participants. Yes, a substantial part of the NSI was privatized before at that point, so they could have said this was substantially done. Presence of a sufficient number of competitor credit-worthy distribution participants no longer holding fast. This has not been done. In fact, I should have put this in red. This has definitely not been done and we are still here. Okay, sorry, this is medium term. So this is medium term, apologies. So, so this slide just talks about the different conditions and you see that some of them have been, some of them haven't. Now the future is the medium-term market. The medium-term market is where we have a sufficient degree of privatization, where people are basically free to, you know, contract with each other, as I explained in the subsequent slide. Just to say that the only thing, we haven't gone into the medium-term stage. Clearly, we are not in medium-term in any way by the market rules. The only thing we've attained that is somewhat in these conditions is that a sufficient degree of privatization of participants in the sector have been privatized. So, okay, challenges to the power market. I won't dwell on this because I'm sure that for anybody who reads the papers, who knows something, you understand that these are the issues so far with our power market. Lack of cost-reflective tariffs, I talked about that. Lack of enforceable and effective contracts across the chain. Gas suppliers are not able to pull the plug when they should, or pull on guarantees. MBET is not able to pull on guarantees. Discos go to court. You know, we have kind of like an insolvent power market. You know, and look at the amount of debt MBET has incurred as at Q3 2020. 144 billion naira. We've had a lot of government interference. I refer to one dark day in our power sector history where, you know, the tariff was reversed. There's still a lot of institutional capacity that can be built with NERC, with TCN, with MBET. With TCN, it's the issue around, you know, evacuation. Basically, TCN is our main traffic conductor, if I put it that way, and they need investment, they need capacity to be able to do that. And DISCOs and TCN are constantly at loggerheads because they think that they are not evacuating power to where it ought to be. And when we talk about distributed energy, we'll talk about how that can help resolve some of those issues. Lack of investment and infrastructure deficits. We are still talking about a large amount of the DISCO's customer base being unmetered. So these are some of our challenges. Now, what I'm going to try to do and connect very quickly between these two slides is how some of these post-privatization developments are dealing with some of the issues, some of the challenges. So one of the things I mentioned is the fact that DISCOs and TCN are constantly at loggerheads about the fact that TCN takes power to where they do not need it. And what embedded generation basically does, we've had this regulation since 2012, but what it basically does is that the distribution company or the consumer of the power has the power, basically, let me put it as a distribution company, power is basically evacuated within a distribution company's network. So you do not need to, you do not need a TCN, except of course you are doing more than 20 megawatts. The regulations provide that you may have to send it through the network. So embedded generation is one of those. If we look at the power sector of the future, embedded, although we've had this regulation for many years, there have been many issues why it's not been able to take off. A lot of the issues are around the issues to do with the power sector and the insolvent state of the distribution companies, because they should be the ones to be able to take advantage of this. But when they can't charge cost-effective tariffs, it becomes an issue, and people are unwilling to put in money into embedded generation if they are not sure of who's going to be paying for it. So let's say that the regulations came out before its time, but for the power sector of the future, we are going to see a lot of these projects, particularly because of this. Now, what is electricity distribution franchising? One of the issues that we also have is that the DISCOs have had problems for a long time with collecting properly. When I say collecting properly, that is dealing with their commercial and their collection losses. And one of the solutions that electricity distribution franchising is supposed to bring is supposed to allow them kind of sub-franchise parts of their network to people who will then focus on doing this and will put in the required investment that is needed. Now, for them to be able to do it in some areas, they will need embedded generation. So we are going to be seeing in the future that hopefully we would have more of franchises with embedded generation in there. I'm not going to be, so there are 4 franchising models that the distribution guidelines have proposed. The DISCOs can be doing between billing and collection, total management of distribution ring-fenced areas, total management of distribution feeders. You can do loss reduction, which entails kind of like A, B, and C, a total management of the area, and also ensuring that you have an obligation to reduce losses and then provide embedded generation. So these are some of the models that we are going to see in the future that distribution companies are going to be entering into with what we call franchisees. Interesting times, because we are going to have to build capacity to be able to do this. Eligible customers, I think we talked about that. That's one of the developments that we've seen. And this was I would say this was a knee-jerk reaction to government's frustration at the time, even though it's provided for in the law, but again, it's something that started before its time, because government was getting increasingly frustrated with the fact that, people require power, are not able to get that power because of all the issues, so allowing customers themselves be able to contract. But we haven't found this to be very, very successful, at least not yet. Let's wait and see. Maps. So as I said, one of the issues that we've had, Mita has said, most of the issues that we've had is there's a large mass of unmetered customers. One of the solutions to that is the map regulation, which we are not sure is going to be jettisoned or is going to be done. But what the idea around maps was basically to have people come in and finance metering for the customers to pay over time, basically. So government started that, tried it, saw that it wasn't really making any traction because there are issues with that program, and then has decided it's not being reversed. Whilst NERC is considering whether to reverse it or keep it, I think they will still keep it. Government, who is trying to ensure the revenue assurance and doesn't have money to keep subsidizing the sector, is now looking to have a metering program, basically to meter, but even that is insufficient. So I will take questions.
Okay, thank you, Dolapo. So we're going to, like Dolapo said earlier, please send your questions to.
I think I saw 2 questions in the chat.
Yes. So I'll just take the 2 questions here, and we're just going to do this for 10 minutes, so you can go to your other presentation. So the first question is it right to conclude that NEMSA's core responsibility is to regulate technical areas of the power sector rather than NERC?
In a sense, yes. So NEMSA, the only part of your question that I would not agree with is rather than NERC. So how I see it is NERC sits at the top and the regulator, and NERC actually has a technical department that actually should be doing some of these things. But NEMSA now has an add-on to it, because NEMSA goes to inspect every facility, even meters. So NEMSA now has a wider scope, in the sense that they now go to inspect and certify both people who are doing the installations, both the people who are doing the installations and the installations themselves. So they have a wider range, but my view is that NERC still sits at the top. It's a challenging, is a bit of a difficult situation, but NERC, if you ask NERC will tell you it does not usurp their responsibility. If you ask NEMSA will tell you, this is my own office. So it's a Nigerian problem. But I wouldn't say that anyone usurps anyone. It's just that it's the private sector developers that then suffer, because you have to comply with NERC and then you have to comply with NEMSA. So I hope I answered.
Yeah, so Oluwase is asking, can IPPs distribute power to regular customers also? I mean, can consumers buy power from IPPs instead of discos?
Yes, you can, at the moment you can, if you are an eligible customer. So one of the conditions for eligible customers are clusters where they consume up to, I think, 2 megawatts monthly. Or yes, I think that's what it is, 2 megawatts. So if you are in that kind of cluster, you know, you can then apply to be an eligible customer who an IPP will supply. But that an IPP will just supply to your house, you know, not as a cluster or not in an estate. No, not at the moment. If you are an industry, for example, so another class of customer is an industrial customer or a commercial customer. As long as you meet the requirements for eligible customers, yes. Within the eligible customer regulations, yes, you can be supplied.
So I think this is a very long question. Dorian is asking, what is the place of competition and antitrust in the new electrical regime?
Good question. Let's just say that we don't really have a competition and antitrust specific regulation. However, what I know is that NERC kind of in an ad hoc way gauges competition and antitrust in certain ways. And that's why you see in some regulations, they would say things like, if you are in the distribution business, you can't also with that entity be in the generation business. You have to do it two separate entities, or they could even say that, oh, if you are in distribution and generation, you know, and I don't know that they've done that for anyone yet, but they could actually say that, oh, if you are occupying this amount of market share, you know, you can't do certain things. But we don't have a specific antitrust and competition regulation or regime in that sense. And for a very simple reason, do we even have enough power? Let's even get, let's get somewhere first. Before we even start talking about antitrust and competition. But let me say that there's a semblance of it. NERC kind of takes it into consideration and kind of puts it into its regulation in some way. Okay.
Okay, so Olusegun is asking, can a state in Nigeria set up its own electricity value chain? Or, which means can it set up its own GenCo, transmission company, and DISCO?
Well, this is an ongoing issue, but by the Constitution, states are in terms of electricity is on the concurrent list, and it talks about what it is that states can do. It restricts states to, as long as you can't do transmission as long as it's on the grid. You can do anything that is off grid, essentially. Anything that does not relate to the transmission grid, you can do. So can you do your own GenCo? Yes, absolutely. You can generate power. Can you have your own transmission company? Is up for debate, but by the Constitution, not really. But it's up, and I know that Lagos State at the moment is looking to do something in that regard. And you know, it's a progressive conversation. We may get to a point where states are going to have to consider having their own transmission network. So it's a valid thing to consider. But at the moment, transmission is still within the remit of federal government. And even the way it's structured in the sector now, if you build a transmission line today, you don't exactly own it. You need to kind of get permission from TCN to build it. And then TCN usually is the one who operates it. We don't yet have, another thing is that we do not have regulation for independent transmission networks. We do have for independent electricity distribution networks. So yes, a state can do its own distribution, if it's independent electricity distribution and is not related to grid, yes, you can. And you'd have seen some projects in Lagos State and a number of states where they have an independent electricity distribution network. So they can be, but its transmission is still a bit fuzzy. Not a bit fuzzy. It is from the Constitution, it is clear that it's federal government. Now, we don't know, we are probably going to have to look at it again. We're probably going to have to talk about it.
Okay, so Dolapo, we're going to start again at 10 minutes past 3. So I'm just going to take maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Right. So Olusegun is asking, if a company has embedded generation license, can it distribute directly to customers?
It depends on, so if you get an embedded generation license, an embedded generator should either be supplied into a distribution company or an independent electricity distribution network, or to an embedded generation and to an eligible customer. So let me put it this way: can you distribute directly to customers? In a way, but those customers must either be within a distribution company network, which means that ECO, if you have an embedded generation license, let's say, and you want to supply to people in, let me say, Lekki, you know ECO covers that area. So it's either that you have a deal with ECO to be able to supply those customers with ECO's agreement, or that area, you've been able to carve it out as an independent electricity distribution network, and you can put your power in. But your role as an embedded generation licensee is to generate power into a network. It is not to distribute. So if you want to distribute, you are either distributing to someone who has a license to distribute, or you go and get a license to distribute within the framework. I hope I answer your question.
Okay, so this is going to be the last question. And please, all questions should be sent to the Q&A section so that we're able to read it out. If you send to the chat box, there's so many messages going on in the chat box. So that's for the next segment. Please send your questions there. And finally, today is the last day of the training. So we're going to send out all the slides for all of the training after this session. Okay, so the final question for this segment is, as a customer who is yet to be metered, is it compulsory for me to pay fully for the estimated bill? Again, is it the responsibility of PHCN or customers to get prepaid meters or to acquire SIM?
Okay. Is it compulsory for me to pay estimated bills? No, I think there was some order or something that said that, if you continue getting estimated bills, you shouldn't pay or something, or you should pay something like that. There's actually, yeah, so if you've been complaining about your meter and you haven't gotten a meter, or you've tried to apply for a meter and you haven't gotten a meter and they're still giving you estimated bill, then you shouldn't be paying, then you should complain. However, please don't sit down in your house and be waiting for them to give you a meter. I would say go and try to get a meter. Because just speaking practically, now this is not being your lawyer, this is not being an advocate, and really you can choose to make, you're a lawyer, so you can choose to make trouble. So, but just speaking practically, the process of untangling estimated bill, no estimated bill, when you finally get your meter, is so much trouble that you just want to try as much as possible to get your meter if you can get it. However, I sympathize with you if it's that you've tried to get a meter and you haven't been able to get a meter. Then I think that you should start writing letters, and go to your business unit and try to get a meter as soon as possible, because your estimated bills won't go away. They'll keep mounting. Even though you make the complaint, what happens practically is that it won't go away. So am I the one supposed to go and get a meter? Ordinarily, you shouldn't be, but you should, because you keep on getting estimated bills. So for your own benefit, you should. I hope I answered your question. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next. I'm going to go into the next segment. I hope that this has been useful. I will stop sharing briefly and go to the next slide.
Okay, so Dolapo, we're going to stop at 3:45 to take questions and close. So we'll.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Sorry, slideshow. Just 1 minute. Okay, so we're talking about renewable energy, off-grid solutions, and mini-grids in Nigeria. And in terms of an outline, we'll just speak generally about renewable energy potential in Nigeria. I won't really talk about the regulatory framework because we've dealt a lot on that in the earlier slides, although there are a bit of differences that I may just pick out, but you will get the slides anyway, so that will be useful for you. Then we'll then talk about distributed energy in Nigeria, recent developments, trends, challenges, and we'll talk a little bit about the global outlook as well. So, this is what Nigeria looks like on a map. Just be sure that, yes. This is what Nigeria looks like on a map in terms of our renewable energy potential. You find that on the right side, more in the north, we have more solar, so it's more bright orange. Now you see that where you have the blue flags, that's where you have hydro. Not like there's no hydro potential in some of those, but that's where you have hydro. Here you have also potential for wind as well, where you have the fans. But you find that we seem to have more radiation, darker in these parts. And that's why you find that a lot of projects, are, I guess, better situated in terms of solar projects, better situated in the north. However, we do have a number of solar projects that are also, on this side and even in the south as well. Southwest, even south-south as well. Although the south-south is kind of gas locked, but you can still find mini grids in the south-south. So this just shows potential. And as I mentioned, see, so like the south-south now has more in terms of hydro, but I know that we also have solar projects. Of course, there is hybrid solar. Hybrid solar basically means that you have solar plants, you have battery or solar and diesel, for some projects. So potential dominant renewable energy sources in the southwest are hydro and solar, south-south hydro, southeast hydro and solar, northeast. Notice that in the northeast they have more of an abundance. And I guess that God just shared it that way because in terms of fossil fuels and in terms of gas and fossil and crude, they don't have that. So I guess God distributed it in a way that they could also get energy. So let's say that maybe that was God's design. So why renewables? I just thought to start with this conversation because a lot of time people ask, why are we talking about renewables when we are a gas-rich country? Why are we even bothering to talk about it? And it's a very valid question. And it continues to be a question that we will continue to discuss as a country and for a lot of African and for a lot of developing countries as to, I'm sure a number of you have heard about energy transition, net zero, and all that's going on in the world and the commitments that different countries are making to reduce their carbon emissions. So I guess that as a country we would have to take a stand as to what we would do. But this is, in terms of why renewables, why should we even be looking at it? This is my own view as to why we should even be paying attention to it. And why did I put this slide up here? It's because we are lawyers. We do it when it comes down to the transactions or comes down to advising the government, whether it's a state government, or whether it's advising a client or whatever, these things come to play. And it's just good to just, for us to continue to look at this space and to understand that this space is here to stay and perhaps to see the potential in this. The Nigerian Bar Association has given a lot of lawyers, the, 1 minute. how, like, this spring step to be able to understand a lot of this in the space of 11 weeks. And it doesn't much understand everything. But I'm sure what this has done for you is open your eyes to opportunities for some of you, you know, and it's opened your eyes to the potential of what you're doing in energy. And even for people who are even doing it, it still doesn't, you can still even be doing energy literacy, carry on a conversation about it. You never know, you know, when your knowledge will be tested. So it's another route to close our energy access deficit, you know, and enhancing our economic growth. I mean, for a country of over 200, you know, do not have access to power. There are places in this where they haven't seen proper, they don't know what it is to have normal eco-disco NEPA lights, you know, where they haven't lived life that way before in this country. So my thinking here is the more the merrier. Yes, we're a gas-rich country, but it takes a lot. That gas is a lot for us to get the gas out of the ground. Yeah, what challenges we are having. So if renewables would help us spur growth, if renewables would help us bridge that access deficit, then we should be looking at it. And they're easier to deploy, particularly on a smaller scale. I mean, it takes upward of 2 to 5 years to extend the grid. For renewables, you are talking about, depending on what you are looking at. If you are looking at the solar home systems, it's a matter of hours. If you are looking at a small box, like a Lumos box, that somebody would have and plug, the way to plug their phone, it will give them 2 light bulbs, you know, and it has a small panel. They are looking at a number of hours for that to be set up. If you are talking about mini grids take, I think at most, maybe, I'm not even sure up to 6 months, maybe 3 to 6 months. I'm not even sure up to 6 months, in fact. So you can easily deploy and get access to power at a quicker pace, and of course, at a cheaper space. The other reason why we should be looking at renewables is technology for renewables, particularly for panels and solar technology and battery technology, is increasingly evolving. Things are getting smaller, things are getting more portable, people are able to get power from different kinds of things. So why shouldn't we take advantage of it, given that we are so many? And just to speak to the issue about, you know, lack of energy access. The other thing is, Nigeria has become increasingly insecure for many reasons. You know, for many reasons, people are unable, people don't have jobs and all of that. The fact is that it's an energy crisis is also one of the things that it points to. And if people had more access to energy, they would be able to do more things. You know, we would have more productive use. And then if you had electricity in certain areas, maybe they will not be as insecure. So there are many sides to this thing. The other thing is, there's a lot of investment going into renewables all over the world. And I hope I can get to a point where I can show you a slide as to the amount of money, even despite COVID, that went into renewables in 2020. So why shouldn't Nigeria be able to attract that investment? Why shouldn't we be able to take part of it? We are not even taking anything. We are not taking what we are getting is nothing compared to what is being spent all over the world. Climate change is very real. Is very real. The effects of climate change affect the more vulnerable people, children, women, you know, people with disabilities, people under that are poorer, you know, floods and all of that. Desertification affects poorer people, and whatever we can do to help that. There are many postulations. People say renewables do not help climate change. There are many people saying differently, but if it does, if it helps in the little, let us try to do that a little bit. Fossil fuels are now in transition. Everybody's moving away from oil. There must be a reason why they're all moving away from oil. And everybody's looking, including corporates, are looking to reduce their carbon emissions and go net zero, basically no carbon emissions. We hope we can get to a world like that. We hope that we'll be able to save our world so that, you know, our children can get some part of it. But why renewables? So that we can reduce carbon emissions. Again, links to climate change is very real. So, moving on. Legal and regulatory framework for renewable energy. I'm not going to go into details here, but this schematic just says, and some of these people we've talked about, some that we haven't talked about, I will refer to, but this schematic just says, basically in a nutshell, who the main actors are. So I will not go through the slide because I've talked a lot about it. I'll just mention, talked about NEMSA, we talked about NERC. Standards Organization of Nigeria, because of the certification that they do for products and equipment, particularly because a lot of our, for renewables, we've not started actually producing as much in terms of panels and equipment as we should. We have a lot of goods imported into Nigeria. And even for those manufacturers, Standards Organization of Nigeria is actually supposed to certify for quality. So that's why they are here as a regulator. Customs service as well, because we are still very import reliant. Nigerian Customs Service is a key stakeholder for renewables, particularly for solar. Even if we're doing a lot of wind, it would include wind as well, particularly for solar, and to do with the, and when I'm talking about challenges, we'll talk about challenges to do with, you know, customs duties and VAT and all of that. Then there's also NESRIA, who are basically enforcing environmental regulations, because even though renewables are supposed to be cleaner, the effects of this, for example, how do we dispose of batteries? Some of the equipment that are used need to be disposed properly because they could by themselves cause a lot of damage to the environment. So when we talk about the growth in renewables, the next step, or the next thing that we need to start thinking about, and that countries are thinking about and dealing with, is how we deal with electronic waste. So that's where agencies like NESRIA come into play. I will speak a little bit about Rural Electrification Agency. I think I had referred to them before and talked about their establishment under the Act. Maybe we just point out some of their key projects and activities. So if you've heard about the NEP, Nigerian Electrification Project, Rural Electrification Agency, as I said, has been very instrumental to pushing renewables, particularly in the mini-grid space, solar home systems, and they've been working, providing performance-based grants in partnership with the World Bank. So what a performance-based grant is, basically, is developers get grants based on certain performance criteria. If you are able to provide, let's say, 1,000 connections, you
But there's something wrong with your
connections to specifications.
There's something wrong with your connection.
Can't pay you back. So for every one connection. Okay, let me change it.
Yeah. There's something
okay,
wrong.
Just 1 minute.
Okay.
Hello?
Okay, it's better now. So you can go on.
Okay. So I was talking about performance-based grants. Sorry. I don't know where I am and where I'm coming from. Okay. So I was talking about performance-based grants, and I was saying that if you spend $500 on a connection, when you get a performance-based grant, you get paid maybe $250 back, you know, so you get a grant that pays back for that connection. So that's what the performance-based grant is for. And the World Bank is doing a lot of that with the REA. We also know about the Energizing Economies Initiative. Basically, this is an initiative by the Rural Electrification Agency to provide power to markets. Again, that's the relationship with economic growth, you know, and climate, well, hopefully some climate change mitigation, because rather than have a bunch of noisy generators in the market, you have cleaner energy and people being able to pay for that energy and be able to do what they need to do to make money. We also have energizing education program as well, where a number of universities have been connected to the grid. I think currently, I don't know the number, but I know that University in Kano, Bayero University, Nnamdi-Azikiwe University, I think Obafemi Awolowo University is ongoing. I think Unilag as well is ongoing. So a number of those projects. Some of them are not necessarily pure renewable. Some of them are hybrid. You have a mix of gas and solar. Yeah, some of them are hybrid. So not all of them are fully renewable. Okay, so there's also the Rural Electrification Fund. Again, this is to enable more region access to electricity, and this is supposed to encourage project developers. Again, it's like the performance-based grant, but this is funded by the Rural Electrification Fund. Basically, the federal government funds this, and they give them technical assistance and incentive. There's also the 5 million Solar Niger connection scheme. Now, this is new. I think this started last year, and this is supposed to, this is CBN with REA basically providing low interest credit facilities to people who are in the upstream. So they've divided into upstream and downstream. So if you're in downstream, you're actually providing the service. So you're either doing solar home systems, you are doing mini grids. In the upstream, you can be manufacturing, you can be doing R&D in solar, you can be manufacturing solar, you can be manufacturing solar panels, you can be manufacturing different kinds of, you can even be manufacturing solar home systems. You can be repairing or maintaining them. So if you're in the upstream side or the downstream side, they're actually providing low interest credit facilities, and it's all towards the goal of expanding energy access to 25 million people. I'm not going to talk through much to the policy, but just to note that, okay, so I think the important thing to note here is that we have not had a lack of policies with respect to renewable energy. I mean, we've been thinking about renewable energy and articulating our thoughts since 2001. So our Nigerian National Electric Power Policy actually had a target for renewables as far back as 2001. So Nigeria's problem has never been that we do not have plans. We have plans well crafted, but it is implementation. So we had another one by the Energy Commission in 2005. We have another one in 2006 by the Federal Ministry of Power, and we had another one in 2015. And for number 3 and number 4, you see that they actually talk about tax holidays for investors, incentives, capital grants, and all of that. How much of that is currently effective? Not much. We are still struggling with whether we should be paying customs duty and VAT for importing solar panels in a country where we do not yet manufacture as many as we need. A few manufacturers here and there, but we are still struggling with this. So sometimes you wonder, and a lot of these policies haven't yet been included in law. So as you all know, most of you even know more than me, a policy is an intention of government until it becomes law. So I guess that the next thing is to include these in law. I think that there's been some movement in that area. There was movement about a renewable energy law, and then there's a movement about putting everything in an overall amended electric power sector or electric power law, a new amended electric power law. So let's see how it goes. We also have another plan that, so this is the latest plan, 2015, where we've set targets to do 30 gigawatts of power by 2030 with 30% from renewables. Let's see how we are in 2021. Let's see how we get there. And then our power sector recovery policy as well also has a plan for delivering 10,000 megawatts. I won't be talking about, I think we talked about this, I won't be talking about, but just to say that for renewables, the same, in terms of regulatory framework, the same regulations, a lot of the regulations apply, a lot of the same regulations would apply if you were doing thermal. Apart from mini grid regulation, if you're doing a mini grid, you are doing a mini grid, irrespective of whether it's solar or whatever the technology is. But just to say that for renewables, we do not, apart from a few like the refit regulations, which is specific to feed-in tariff and which is not even effective at the moment, a lot of the regulations apply for renewables are the same. Now, for environmental impact assessment, whilst generally you are supposed to do environmental impact if there is if you see that there's an impact to the environment. For renewable energy projects, you may not be required to. And I know that there's been some work also being done for smaller projects to have a guideline that gives a more simplified process. For those of you involved in power projects, you know that to do an environmental impact assessment, you have to do it over 2 seasons. So it takes about a year. And sometimes if you are doing it as an environmental and social impact assessment, it's usually more expensive because you are trying to assess the impact not only on the environment, but also on the people in that area. So you will be doing a lot more and it actually costs a lot more money. So what has been found is that for smaller projects, you know, it's a lot more, it's costly on smaller projects. So there are a few things that have been done to make it cheaper for smaller projects. But by the EIA guidelines, renewable projects are in category 2. So you don't necessarily need a full EIA, except if you are in an environmentally sensitive area. Just thought to point that out. Okay, distributed energy. So what is distributed energy? You remember that we talked about why renewables, and one of the things that renewables helps to do is distributed energy. One of the things that renewables enable is distributed energy. What's distributed energy? Is basically generating electricity in a decentralized manner. Basically, you are generating electricity closer to the person that needs it. So typically, generation projects can be that, for example, the power we get on the grid, the power I'm getting where I am in my office now in Lekki, could be supplied from Jeba. The reason why I can get that power is because when Jeba, when Kainji produces that power, or when Shiruro produces that power, it gets on the transmission line, gets to a substation at some point within a co-distributions network. And then it stepped down before it comes to mine. It stepped down, goes through that substation before it comes to me. So of course, I just said that in summary, but there's a lot more to that. So that's how typically when you are doing on-grid, that's how it is. But with distributed energy, it is power that is closer to you and you're able to access, closer. So why? Because we talked about the reason, one of the reasons for Nigeria is our weak transmission infrastructure, given the fact that, the capacity, the fact that we've had and which becomes even more far-fetched, which we may never be able to upgrade. I remember years ago when we talked about super grid. I remember at the time when we were doing privatization and TCM will be talking about the super grid. Who is going to fund that super grid now? That would be billions and billions. So it's become apparent that it's going to be quite difficult to be funding a super grid, and that we have to, distribution companies, energy suppliers have to find a way to be able to get the power closer to the people who need it. We talked about poor electrification rates, our lack of access to electricity. We talked about lack of security and reliability. So because, for example, using my example of power coming from Kainji or coming from Jeba, because of the losses that would happen, the trips, that's why we say we have, we have shutdowns, and all of that. Because of all that happens, it's most times unreliable. That's why we have a lot of grid, we always have a lot of grid blackouts or a lot of grid shutdowns. When the power is closer, the risk of having losses or having those shutdowns are less. So that's another reason why, that's another plus for distributed energy. Of course, increase in population, more people, more power. And just related to some of the things I've said, the fact that there's less investment available for super projects like what could help revamp our grid, although we still need to do some of those projects, but they take some time, they take quite a bit of time. In the meantime, rather than leave people in darkness, we can use distributed energy. So what are the advantages? A few advantages over that. I think it relates to some of the things you said. Distributed energy helps with reliability of the power, reduce transmission losses, and increased access. So I just want to touch on, I want to talk about mini grids because one of the things that we're supposed to talk about. And this was one legislation that, well, has kind of changed the off-grid landscape, or is in the process of changing the off-grid landscape. In 2016, we had a mini grid regulation issued by NERC, and what the objective was to increase access to what we call it's actually to unserved and underserved areas, essentially. So what's an unserved area? An area that doesn't have any electricity at all. So an area where a disco does not have any infrastructure. That's an unserved area, where they don't even see that power. An underserved area is an area where they have the distribution infrastructure, or maybe they don't even see light, maybe 2 hours a day. That's underserved. So I'm using that parameter as my example. That's not what is in the regulation. So the other objective is to incentivize mini grid investment in Nigeria, grid extension in a way. So this is not grid extension with the transmission wires, but this is grid extension in the sense that people who for many years have not been paying for electricity, when you do mini grids, and I'll explain what a mini grid is, we'll start knowing how to pay for electricity and be able to reduce collection and commercial losses. So a mini grid is basically, let me put it this way, is a contained system. It's a system that has its own power generation and its own distribution. So it can either work in isolation, which means that it can either work within a community that has no distribution infrastructure, or you can actually connect it to a distribution company's network. The one connected to a distribution company's network is an interconnected mini grid. The one that operates on its own in an area that has no distribution network is what is called an isolated mini grid. So interconnected mini grids are connected to a distribution company's network. Isolated mini grid is not connected. So typically, you would find isolated mini grids in places where discos are not present and where they don't plan to be present for at least 5 years. If you are advising a mini grid developer, that's what they should be looking at. A place where there hasn't been electricity and where at least for 5 years, the disco doesn't plan to come. The question you ask me is, how do I know when a distribution company is not coming there for 5 years? What the regulation says is that NERC should be confirming to you that the distribution company will not be going there. That will entail them asking the disco. Do the discos answer? Not all the time, but I hear that they're answering now. But I hear that a system has been devised and at least we are getting responses from NERC on that. So what capacity is this? Now, can you build a mini grid everywhere and does it cover all capacities? No. So that system, that contained system I said, or integrated system is between 0 kilowatts and 1 megawatt. It stops at 1 megawatt. Let's remember that the Electric Power Sector Reform Act says that if you are generating power beyond 1 megawatt, you need a license. Apart from where it's for self-use, you need a license. So what this mini grid regulation has done is between that 0 kilowatts and 1 megawatt, which is in an integrated form, you get a mini grid permit for it. It's supposed to be a more simplified process because these are smaller projects. However, if you are building a project between 0 kilowatts and 100 kilowatts, you do not necessarily need to get a permit, but you need to register with NERC. Now, but one of the reasons why you may need to get a permit is that you need to secure your asset. If somebody is investing in that asset, why I say secure the asset is that if you have a permit, you have a better chance of a distribution company if a decision company decides to come and encroach the area, within 5 years of your getting there, you're actually supposed to be compensated. That's what the regulations say. But if you are a permit, if you are only registered, if they come, you just pack your load and move somewhere else. So that's the plus for a permit. But I guess that at the time when this regulation was done, most people wanted to, how do I put it? Most people who were looking to play in this space didn't want to be regulated at all. They just wanted to be able to do things, you know, without as much regulation as possible, because a lot of people feel that, you know, the sector is overregulated. I have a slightly different view. It's not overregulated, but, you know, we could make some tweaks here and there. And for an interconnected mini grid, what you need to do is go and agree with the distribution company and execute a tripartite agreement between yourself, the community, and the distribution company. So for the isolated mini grid, the agreement has to be between yourself and the community, the developer and the community. But for the interconnected mini grids, you have to involve DISCO and get that registered. So these are some obligations of a mini grid permit holder. As I said, it's supposed to be a simplified process, but the mini grid permit holder has some obligations. And the reason why a mini grid permit holder has some obligations is because there are certain standards that NERC hopes that they will be able to meet to what's called grid standard, particularly if they're going to be connecting to a distribution network. Okay, so just speaking quickly to different kinds of models that we've seen of distributed energy. One is energy as a service. Now, energy as a service is in different ways. You can have energy as a service in a building as a standalone, where basically the provider provides you power as a service and you don't have to pay for the capital investment of that. And so you basically pay, you know, on a monthly basis or however way. And we find that a lot of companies do that. That same energy of service can be translated into the solar home systems market as well, where like a Lumos box, for example, or an Azuri box, where you don't necessarily own the box. Not all. I think for Lumos, I think you can own it. But for some solar home systems, you don't have to own the box, or you pay a certain amount monthly. And for much more poorer areas, some of them can be paying maybe 1,000 naira or so monthly, you know, or more, you know. But what is very interesting about it is that they pay for what they need. They basically pay for what they need. Embedded generation can also be some kind of a form of distributed energy, because if it's provided in the area where it is required, you know, it doesn't need transmission, you know, to basically evacuate it. It can also be termed as distributed energy. And we talked about in the other slides about, you know, the power sector of the future. We are going to see energy companies or energy service companies or even distribution companies come out with models where all their customer categories, they're going to be able to provide services to different categories of customers, you know, within their franchise area. So we're hopeful that we're going to start to see things like this even amongst the DISCOs as well. So this is just examples. This is an example of, I think this is the first interconnected mini grid, Mokoloki, in Ibadan DISCO's network or franchise area. This is an isolated mini grid done by a company called JVE. The Mokoloki was done by a company called Nile Tropical Technologies with Ibadan DISCO. There's one that's been done by Abuja now for Wuse Market as well. So this just gives some examples of some of the players in the energy as a service market, and solar home systems, and standalone solar in mini grids. Some trends in the Nigeria renewable energy sector. I've talked about the fact that we are seeing more people do power as a service, whether for commercial, in fact, even for commercial buildings, we are seeing that as well. We are seeing a lot more advocacy around renewables. We are seeing there's increased awareness, and we're seeing a lot of people, you know, start to develop capacity. We are seeing deployment of mini grids, and we are seeing actually increase. We are seeing some companies that are starting to well, not produce or manufacture the plants, but they're assembling at least. They started to assemble. We're also seeing renewables, used in other sectors, in agriculture, in banking, telecommunications. So the telecom space, when I say telecom space, I'm talking about the base in terms of their infrastructure, their base stations and all of that. We are seeing them use a combination of renewables a lot. And if you combine, I've not done that study, but I'm sure that if we do a combination of how much renewables they are using, the telecommunication companies are using at the moment, is quite substantial. So we are seeing a lot of ripple effects, even in health. So during COVID, and just speaking to number 8, during COVID, there were a number of facilities that could be rigged up very quickly because solar facilities could be set up within a month or in a matter of weeks. And that helped with the COVID response. We are also seeing corporates that label themselves the RE100 that are committed to 100% renewables. Some of you may have read about Amazon. Amazon is investing a lot of money in renewables for its own operations, and they're going 100%. This is just one. There are a number of multinationals in the beverage space as well that have commitments, international commitments, to reduce their carbon emissions. So they're actually making their factories, people like Nigerian breweries or Heineken, we call them Heineken now. Heineken, I think even international breweries at the moment are looking to commit to, doing more renewables. Challenges, I think these are explanatory. I'd like for you to read them because we actually have to close. But if you have any particular questions on any of the challenges, please feel free to ask during the Q&A. Just one thing on global best practice. So one thing to point out in this slide, and this is just something for our own, just for our own thoughts, and just as I said, for us to think about what's happening in the rest of the world with renewables. So in Africa, for example, South Africa is considered kind of like as a leader, and that's because they set out the framework that needs to be in place, for renewables. Not like they don't have their own problems, but they've set out the right incentives, tax deductions, depreciation allowances, funds to be able to do this. And if we are really serious about renewables and even our gas, there are some things that we need to put in place. I think that's the point that I'm trying to make with this slide, that for us to be able to incentivize for more of these projects to come, government has to be able to provide incentives. And on the right is the European Union example. So these are global best practice from different countries. You can look at it when you get slides, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. I got this from a report, I think this is a 2020 report, and these are basically countries who have set out their plans as to what they want to do by 2030. So the United Nations SDG goal for clean energy is 2030, for us to have clean energy, increase in clean energy by 2030. So a lot of these countries you see some of them have plans for 2030, some of them have plans for 2050. I don't know, the people I'm talking to on this slide may be future ministers or future advisors to Senate or future. So it's good for us to be looking at all these things so that if you are in a position to advise, we are lawyers here, that's what we do. Let's look at what's been done in the world. We don't have to exactly copy what's been done, but we can make it suit our own environment and see how we can also grow our economy. You may be advising a state, for example, and you want to encourage renewables. Best practice is always great to look at best practice and see what they're doing. This is also global best practice in renewable energy. This was between 2030. So for this is what additions are required in terms of government targets between 2020 and 2030. You can see that solar PV occupies the largest space, followed by wind, onshore wind, followed by offshore wind, followed by biomass, and then geothermal is very small. But what's the point I'm trying to make here? The point I'm trying to make here is that even though a lot of countries seem to have covered ground, there is still a lot that needs to be done. At least for Nigeria, we have not covered anything. We have not even done the 30% of the 30 gigawatts that we have pledged to do. So there's so much, that we need to do. I just want to share something if I can. Let me see if I'll be able to share it, just for you to see in terms of the kind of investment that went into renewables in 2030. Let me see if I can share it. I'm sorry, I may not be able to, but let me read it from my screen. I'm not sure why I can't share it. Okay, I'll just read. So, we had 501.3 billion going to renewables in 2020 alone, and it was a 9% increase despite COVID. And this is just for us to see how much money is going into renewables at the moment. The highest countries, in terms of what countries rank highest in terms of their investment, China ranked highest, followed by, so China ranked highest for renewable energy, followed by electrified transport. United States was next, followed by Germany. And then you have Japan, United Kingdom, France. So just for us to have to understand, what's happening in the world all over, so that, when we are called upon to advise on how we take this forward, at least we look at global best practice and are able to, advise, appropriately with solutions that would suit our environment. I hope this has been useful.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dolapo. Okay, so we're just going to go straight to it because we don't have a lot of time. So the first question, I got that from the chat box, which was quite interesting. Because what's the difference between transmission and distribution?
Dolapo, you're muted.
Yeah, Dolapo, you're muted.
Apologies. So let me explain it this way. When power is generated, it's generated at very high voltages. So it's generated sometimes at what is called 330 or 132 kV, kilovolts. So it's very high. It's not the power that enters your house that you use to charge your phone, your TV, or use your phone. Now, what happens with transmission is the transmission infrastructure, the lines, are high voltage lines that takes that power from the generation station when it is stepped down and evacuates it to the next level, which is the distribution level. Now, the distribution level is that the only way I can explain this thing is kind of like from a technical level. I'm not an engineer, but I'm just saying how I understand it. So you are coming from a high voltage, 132, which you cannot use in your house. It comes down the lines. I don't know if you were on when I was talking about how power is transmitted. So let's say how I get power in my house when it's on grid. So Shiroro produces power. That power is taken by TCN on high voltage lines, 132 kV. The lines that transmit that power to the next substation in Alagbon to Eco Disco are transmission lines. So that is transmission infrastructure. It's at a higher level of power. When it comes to distribution, distribution is a lower voltage of power. It's still not what enters into your house. But the difference between distributions of coverage. Now, at transmission level, people don't take power at that level, except for industries that are high voltage, particularly like steel industries. So transmission is the backbone. Transmission is the higher level, is where power comes from the stations. Distribution is how the power gets from transmission when it steps down, and it comes down into a co-disclosed network, including our homes. I hope I've tried to explain it as much as possible, but just to say that for that power to enter your house, it comes down at 11 kV or even less. So what you use in your house is not what is transmitted. Everything is stepped down. What finally comes to your house is a lower voltage. Transmission is higher voltage.
Okay. So Doreen is asking, do you think the current legal regime of electricity provides enough incentive for state governments to invest?
I think it does. I think it does. And I think that we have to, I think that state governments have to, I guess that there are certain fights they have to initially. Well, there's the bad precedent that we had with Lagos State's initial project, I forgot what it was called now, Enron, where that was an investment made, private investment made, but they all went wrong because government stepped in and said that, it was supposed to be at federal level and not at state, and Lagos State paid dearly for it. But that won't happen today. What I say is that I think our legislation as it is allows for state government to at least do generation. And mind you, a lot of states actually participate in distribution. They actually own a lot of distribution networks that the DISCOs currently operate. So there are many states that have actually invested in distribution. I think that states can participate in generation. I think they can participate as things are now. They can do generation, they can do distribution, they can do mini grids. What they have powers to do currently should allow them to be able to power their people. And yes, it should attract investment, but the states need to do what they need to do. And that's another lecture for another day.
Okay, so Azubuike is asking, what are the major challenges facing development of renewable energy sector in Nigeria, and how can the identified challenges be surmounted? Yeah. Did you get that?
Okay. Yes, I think I pointed out a few. There are a few on my slides, but because of time, I couldn't really run through. I think the key thing is a commitment on the part of, I would say, federal government is doing a lot through REA. That's the truth. The thing with renewables is that to deploy them, there's a significant cost to deploying them. So you find that the initial projects that are being done, that's why you're seeing a lot of grants in those projects, because the initial issues with deploying them is a lot. But this is for distributed energy. Now, when you even talk about on-grid, we had 14 solar PPAs that the government was negotiating, but didn't turn out well. And I would say that on the on-grid level, the reason why we haven't been able to have on-grid solar is mainly because of some of the issues that we are having in electricity. Not some of the issues we are having in electricity sector. Government, at the end of the day, could not commit to make certain commitments in terms of guarantees that investors could put money to. But apart from that, there is also enabling business environment. There is also things like the incentives, not saying in policy that that there are incentives, but when we import things, they still ask us to pay duty and pay 5% VAT. I don't know if any of you knows that last year there was actually an order by the Ministry of Finance saying that there will be no VAT on renewable energy products, and FIRS then sent a counter. A counter publication to say that that's not holding. And then now when you import, you will pay 5% import duty, you will pay VAT 7.5%. So when we don't provide an enabling business enabling environment for businesses, there's no way that will work. And I also think that's kind of answers your question.
Okay, so quickly go to this. Apart from hydro, from other renewable sources, which other renewable sources is connected to the national grid? I don't know. That's
okay,
just.
We don't have any, apart from hydro is the only renewable energy source currently connected to the energy grid.
Okay, and how many megawatts of electricity is Nigeria currently generating from renewable sources?
I don't have it from the top of my head, but at least if you look at a combination of Jeba, Kainji, let me see if I can't tell you what the percentage is off the top of my head, sorry, but you can Google it. You can find it if you Google it, but maybe in terms of percentage, maybe it's about 20% or so of what we currently generate.
Okay, so MSA is asking, can license still be granted to any other company besides the existing GENCOs and DISCOs to generate and distribute electricity in large quantity, even to companies interested in doing a massive renewable energy generation?
Yes, yes. You remember when we're looking at the other slides, I talked about independent power producers. So you can get a generation license, yes. And depending on who it is you are supplying to, and if NERC thinks that, if NERC thinks that it's something that would not be cherry picking or taking away the DISCOs markets, yes, you can. And it can be embedded generation as well. So you can have an embedded generation license that allows you to be able to supply into a distribution network that's supplying to those people, yes.
Okay, so Nina is asking, what do you think about the feasibility of feed-in tariffs in Nigeria?
At the moment, feed-in tariffs, not feasible, because behind a feed-in tariff should be funding. Behind a feed-in tariff, because what is a feed-in tariff? A feed-in tariff is essentially a way to incentivize renewable projects. So what a feed-in tariff does is that a developer goes through a process and agrees in a PPA that I will be paid this amount for a PPA maybe over 20 years. This is the amount that I will be paid. And government ensures that that tariff is paid. So it's kind of, this is how it works, kind of like it's encouraging an investor to put in money up front to build a generation plant, and what it gets in return is a guaranteed tariff, if I use that word loosely, a guaranteed tariff that this tariff will be paid over the next so years. But you know that for you to be able to guarantee that over a number of years, there has to be something that stands behind it to ensure that that money is paid. We all know now that a lot of people who are supplying power on the grid, a lot of the generation companies are being paid, partly paid by CBN, because there's a subsidy at the back of it. And that is because DISCOs are still not able to remit 100% of what they're supposed to remit for the power that they're buying. So one of the reasons why it's not yet viable and why our feed-in tariff regulation is not effective is because that structure behind it has not been created. But I have you know that the feed-in tariff is being reviewed. Whether there's going to be a structure behind, maybe we should be looking at more commercial things, although the fact is that the world all over, feed-in tariffs are being built, they are being reviewed, and people are looking at other ways of doing them. But let's see.
Okay, I can see Dr. Oni is actually engaging.
Yes, he has a comment. Yes. He said there's a debate whether large hydro plants are renewables. True, but people say that they are not renewables. The fact is that it replenishes. People say that they're not renewables because of the environmental effects that they have. It's debatable. I cannot tell you that it's a yes or a no, but if we go by the scientific definition, it's a renewable. Environmental impact is another thing.
Okay, so I think this will be the last question. Mojisola is asking, there's a recent video of a young man from the East that built a mini transmitter stroke grid from crude oil. How is the government responding to partner with private initiatives such as this to increase the generation of power and bring to an end the nightmare of no lights in the nation?
I don't know. That person needs to get that his small experiment to a real concept and now look for somebody to fund it and take it forward. But I get your point. I get your point. We should have agencies in this country that encourage those kinds of inventions or that encourage and try to develop the concept. We should then have a process where private institutions can then fund that. In a lot of countries, things that are developed in universities or by research institutes are then developed into commercially viable whether inventions or whether project models and all that. So I get your point that every little helps. For example, I know that I think for some of our small hydros, I know of one developer who actually are fabricating their own turbine. So things like this are happening. The key thing is that do we have what it takes to incentivize and encourage those people? Do we have the structure?
Okay, so just the last question before I hand over to either Dr. Oni or Tobena. With the fact that there is no strong legal framework aside from EBSRA, do you think that the policies are sufficient to regulate the renewable energy sector in Nigeria? That's the last question.
They obviously haven't been sufficient because some of the stories I've just told you have shown you that they have not been sufficient. When we say that this is our policy, and then when you actually go and import your panels and customs tells you, me, I don't have that memo, is not pay your money, so it's very inconsistent. Now, the fact is that where we are, even when I agree that we need to encode it in law, but what is the most important is having a holistic approach to it. And what I mean by holistic is that if the federal government of Nigeria wants to encourage renewables, the memo should be gotten by all the stakeholders and they should follow suit and not, be having different policies, because at the end of the day, it's the business people and the project developers that suffer. So we need to stop acting in silos as a country and act holistically. If government has a target of renewables increasing by 30%, then let's all work towards it. Someone said I have not reacted to his question. Hey, I'm sorry. Hey,
don't say that the question.
I did not ignore your question.
So if you, they should have some Q&A section.
Would renewable energy access? Okay, I've seen this question. Would access to renewable energy help to foster environmental justice? Environment. I'm not fully clear on what you mean by environmental justice. But if what you mean is that will renewable energy help with climate change, to an extent, yes. But environmental justice, if you are saying justice to where the environment has been maybe destroyed or something, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm sorry, Dolapo, please, there's a very last question. She came back again. She's asking that you said something about Nestra.
Oh, Nesria. It's Nesria. It's not Nestra, it's Nesria. And basically, they are not the enforcement arm for environmental protection.
Okay.
It's Nesria, not Nestra.
Okay, so over to you, Tobena. Thank you, Dolapo.
Okay, thank you very much, first to the delegates for attending. But this has been an amazing set of lectures that we've had from the Energy Law and Policy faculty. Thank you very much, Dolapo, for a very illuminating session today. I'm sure that everyone enjoyed it. I mean, the quality of questions will tell you that the delegates actually followed, and the comments have been quite commendable. Thank you very much for your time today. I want to say a special thank you to all the members of the Energy Law and Policy faculty for putting together this very wonderful series of trainings over a period of 15 days. Today is actually the very last day. I'd like to thank especially my friend, who also is a member of the governing board of the Institute of Continuing Legal Education, Dr. Ayodele Oni, for leading the faculty on energy law and policy. Thank you very much, Ayo, and I can see that you're on today. Thank you. I also want to thank Shola Arifayon, Stella Duru, Dr. Dioya Defolu, Dolapo, who is here, Desmond Oba, Yemisi Awonuga, Olajumoke Arowolo, Yemi Oke, Aderemi Ogumbanjo, and Akindeji Oyebode for their time. I just want to say that it's very commendable that colleagues who are otherwise very busy have found the time to give back to the profession. And this is one thing that we all find very illuminating and gratifying about the MBA. And I say that they've delivered these trainings at no cost whatever. It's totally cost neutral to the MBA. They've done it for free, and they've given us a very high quality, high standard level of training. And I'm sure that if we had to price or pay for it, it will cost us a lot. So I thank them. I also want to say to participants that there are a lot of focused trainings going on. Things are very difficult in the country. Diversification and getting into new areas of practice is something that I think everybody should pay particular attention to. Our ideology is to try and focus on developmental issues. So for instance, on the 11th of May, there'll be a group mentorship session by Chief Anthony Digbo, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, and I encourage as many as possible to attend. The focus for us is really on training, technical trainings for members, mentorship and career development trainings, and also business development trainings. And I'll tell you that these continuing professional development initiatives are very well thought through and focused for our development. I also want to thank Nta Etiken, Mebele Keke, and all the others who have moderated various sessions of these trainings. Thank you very much for participating. In the coming months, we're going to have, in June, we're going to have a training on litigation from a very, very solid faculty. We're also going to have a training on finance in July. So I hope that you all keep participating, and we wish you, on behalf of the Institute of Continuing Professional Development of the MBA, and on behalf of the president of the MBA himself, I say thank you to everybody for participating. God bless you all, and see you next time.
Thank you.